Hello, everyone. Hello, bonjour, Annie, and welcome to the 2021 EECOM conference. I'm Lindsay Bunce. I'm the Executive Director of EcoSchools Canada, and on behalf of our conference partners, Hilary Inwood at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto, Haley Higdon from Natural Curiosity, and the team at TDSB EcoSchools, we are so thrilled that you're joining us. This conference is hosted on behalf of the Canadian Network for Environmental Education and Communication, otherwise known as EECOM, and welcomes over 800 educators and youth from coast to coast to coast, and actually beyond. We even have some international participants joining us as well. Cette conférence est organisée au nom du Réseau canadien d'éducation et de communication environnementale et accueille plus de 800 jeunes éducateurs et éducatrices d'un océan à l'autre. Our focus this year is on urban environmental education. With most of the world's population living in urban areas, helping everyone understand their impact on the environments in which they live is key to making our cities more sustainable and livable. Cette année, nous nous concentrons sur l'éducation environnementale urbaine. La majeure partie de la population mondiale vivant dans les zones urbaines. Il est essentiel d'aider chacun et chacune à comprendre notre impact sur l'environnement dans lequel nous vivons afin de rendre les villes plus durables et plus vivables. We hope that the next 3 days are filled with learning, inspiration, and connection. As we continue to navigate the challenges presented by COVID-19, we hope that EECOM 2021 invites you to explore new ideas and see what can be possible as we work towards our shared sustainability goals. Nous espérons que les 3 prochains jours seront remplis d'apprentissage, d'inspiration et de connexion. Alors que nous continuons à faire face aux défis présentés par COVID, nous espérons que la conférence EECOM vous invite à explorer des nouvelles idées et à identifier ce qui est possible alors que nous travaillons vers la réalisation de nos objectifs communs. Before I invite Adam Young, EECOM's board chair, to come and say a few words, I'd like to say some thank yous to the many folks that have helped make this event possible. A huge thank you to our sponsors, TD Friends of the Environment Foundation, Cascades, Earth Rangers, the Outdoor Learning Store, and ET for your support. A giant high five to our conference steering committee, our team of volunteers, and the EECOM board of directors. Big virtual hugs to my fellow co-chairs, Hilary and Haley, and to our amazing conference coordinator, Elise Kennedy. Everyone has worked very hard to bring you the most amazing event possible, and we really hope you enjoy it. And now over to Adam.
Merci, thanks, Lindsay. My name is Adam Young. I'm the chair of the Canadian Network for Environmental Education Communication. Puis au nom du conseil d'administration de EECOM, j'aimerais remercier tous nos participants, tous nos conférenciers, tous les personnes qui sont organisées la conférence cette année. It's a great pleasure to just say a few welcome words on behalf of EECOM. We understand that for us, this is a virtual first, over 800 participants from across Canada and around the world joining us to share and engage with great conversations, discussions, and professional development on environmental education, even while we're at a distance and are asked to be apart physically, but together emotionally and hopefully intellectually as well over the coming days. Please take advantage of all the great, beautiful things that every EECOM conference offers, including our Eco Expo with over 30 different organizations across Canada that you can explore beginning this evening or anytime throughout the conference, as well as our new event where we have a bunch of fun 5 à 7, but tomorrow, 7 to 9, technically tomorrow. Please feel free to register for some of those great learning opportunities to share and socialize together.
Next, I would really like to thank TD Friends of the Environment Foundation, who have supported EECOM 2021 conference by removing barriers to access for Indigenous participants. TD Friends of the Environment also supported in the past Natural Curiosity with the creation of the 2nd edition of our educator resource, which focuses on the importance of Indigenous perspectives in children's environmental inquiry. I'd now like to welcome Mandeep Karod, Regional Manager, Pacific and Prairie Regions, who on behalf of TD-FEF will introduce our keynote speaker. Welcome, Mandeep.
Thank you so much. Good morning. I'm really happy to be here today as part of the conference. That was phenomenal, Nancy. It was really impactful to listen to. So thank you for your words. So my name is Mandeep Karod. I'm the Regional Manager for TD Friends of the Environment Foundation. I am based in Vancouver, and I want to acknowledge the traditional territory of many nations here, including the Coast Salish, the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Stolo nations. So I've had the privilege of being the TD-FEF Regional Manager in Western Canada for 10 years this September. So I have had this great privilege of seeing the evolution of many of the applications that come our way. I'm proud to say that TD has changed over time, that we've responded to schools and community groups as they identify what their needs are and identify areas of importance. So our work predominantly focuses on greening, low carbon economies, but with schools specifically in the projects we've seen, TD-FEF has been a great supporter of that work, but I want to acknowledge all the people on the ground. So it's people in this room that come together. As a funder, we get a lot of credit, for being able to give those dollars, but really it's the magic on the ground that happens with all the dedicated people. And the best projects are those that take place where we have collaboration with students, teachers, administrators, school boards. It's really important to have community involvement so that we're all invested in these local green spaces. So today I have the great privilege of introducing Larissa Crawford, founder and managing director of Future Ancestors Services. So it's quite a bio. I'm going to be reading off the page here because Larissa is quite an individual. So Larissa is a restorative circle keeper, published Indigenous anti-racism researcher, award-winning ribbon skirt artist, and proudly passes on Métis and Jamaican ancestry to her daughter, Zaira. She is the founder of Future Ancestor Services, a youth-led professional services social enterprise that advances equity and climate justice through lens of ancestral accountability and anti-racism. So Future Ancestors Services is an Indigenous and Black-owned, youth-led professional services social enterprise that advances climate justice and equity with a lens of anti-racism and ancestral accountability. While centering decolonized and indigenized practices, we support our clients and community in addressing systemic issues that disadvantage groups of people, our connections to land and others, and the well-being of Earth. Under Larissa's leadership, and since their launch in April 2020, the organization has mobilized over 20,000 in donations for anti-racist and climate justice initiatives. Larissa and her team seek to increase their clients' capacity to honor people and planet through their minds, work, and spaces, and do so while leveraging decolonized and indigenized approaches to doing business. Among their 140 plus diverse clients are small, youth-led collectives and nonprofits, Canada's most influential law firms and publishing houses, and the highest offices of Canadian government. Larissa's experiences have led to her specializations in race-based data collection, Indigenous and race and anti-racism research, accessibility, restorative circle keeping, restorative practice and conflict resolution, climate justice, and public policy. Through programs such as Cohort X Climate Justice, the Action Canada, and the Youth Climate Lab Future Exchange Fellowships, and the Raven Trust Capital Fireweed Fellowships, Larissa continues her learning. I'm very proud to introduce Larissa Crawford.
Thank you, Mandeep. And Miigwech Gita Kunadad. Thank you so much for opening the space. Nancy, I really appreciated the way you took the time to speak your language. and to give us a beautiful overview of the territories of your traditional lands and of traditional ways of being. I think much of what you said and how you opened our space aligned with the direction that this next hour is going to be going in. And so I'll be referring and coming back to the brilliance that you shared this morning. Hello, welcome everyone to this keynote. I'm going to introduce myself. Tase, Kia Matin, Larissa Crawford Dishne, Gashin, Calgary Nuiken, puis mi famille Penetanguishin, puis Jamaica Nuikan. Bonjour, bon matin, je m'appelle Larissa Crawford, je suis en Calgary. J'ai une ascendance métisse de Penetanguishin et une ascendance afro-caribéenne de Jamaïque. Hey, good morning. My name is Larissa Crawford. I am calling in from Treaty 7 territory, the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina and the Stoney Nakoda nations, as well as Métis Nation Homeland Region 3. I first acknowledged myself in Michif Cree and then in French. Those are two of my ancestral languages. I acknowledge that I carry Métis ancestry from Penetanguishene, Ontario, and Afro-Caribbean ancestry from Jamaica. And this is really important for me to acknowledge because understanding my ancestry, understanding where I come from has really informed the work that I do. And I'll explain that in a moment. Now, as we get started, you're going to see this slide deck. There are going to be a lot of links in this slide deck, a lot of further learning. And I want to make sure y'all have an opportunity to get your hands on this. Now, conference participants, people who've registered for the conference, they will get this sent at the end of the day. But if you're watching from YouTube or if you aren't officially registered for the conference, you can still download the slides. I encourage you to just take a minute to go and get them, access them, have them open. It's a great idea to have them open as we go through today. I'm going to be kind of jumping around from the links on the slide deck. So you can access the slide deck from that short little link that I've included on this slide. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to get that. Maybe take a picture of the screen in the next 10 seconds so that you have that link. And I'll share this link again at the end of the session. And I'll keep that up as we kind of wind down. So I'm going to be switching the slide in 5. Take a picture if you need to. 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. So again, thank you, Mandeep, for such a wonderful introduction. I don't want to spend too much time on myself. There's a lot of links in the slide deck that you can kind of go to explore a bit more about who I am, what I do. But I'll come back to this notion of ancestry. And we're going to talk about this in a bit, but this idea of knowing who I am, how I came to these lands, what my ancestors did and didn't do. Taking the time a couple of years ago, especially, to really research that, to really understand. For example, one of my Métis ancestors owned Mohawk slaves. To really sit with that, to figure it out, to read that, but then to really sit with that. And to think about, okay, how am I accountable to the actions of people I'm directly descended from? How did their actions, which caused harm to our peoples, situate me in a more privileged position, in a position where I don't have to overcome certain barriers, I don't have to overcome certain problems because of who I am and what my ancestors did? As I look to the history of my ancestors, how my Afro-Caribbean ancestors were stolen from Africa, most likely West Africa, and brought to Jamaica. Learning about the practices that slave masters used to remove fathers and their roles, their traditional Indigenous roles in their family units. Understanding that history and how that has informed modern day fatherhood relationships in those communities understanding how my father was affected by these colonial slave legacies, how his father and his father and his father had to manage and deal with the trauma of those slave practices. Understanding how that shaped my relationship with my father brought a lot of healing. Understanding how my realities and my experiences are not just my single experiences. I'm not the only one experiencing something, but that I'm living within legacies that my ancestors, your ancestors, the ancestors of the original caregivers of these lands, the ancestors who created Canada, what is currently known as Canada, the state of Canada. Our realities today were shaped by their actions and inactions. And understanding that, exploring that has not only brought me healing, it's brought me inspiration to see how strong so many of my ancestors were, what they overcame. Gives me so much hope and inspiration for what I can overcome. It gives me agency because I know that my actions and inactions, just like my ancestors, will shape the realities for future generations, for present generations, for my generation. Thinking like that is why I do the work that I do. Thinking like that is how I do the work that I do. Now, Future Ancestor Services, I founded this with my founding team, so Chukwudi Enigmo and Samantha Matters, to specifically work at this intersection of racial and climate justice. Because we're all passionate about environment and environmental work. But we saw this gap, and we have been seeing this gap of not having the discussion of how race and racism and colonialism. I know I'm using a lot of big words right now. Don't worry, we're gonna have a whole bunch of resources to learn more about what I'm talking about, but just bear with me. We wanted to explore this and work at this intersection, to work in environmental spaces with intentional efforts to bring in a conversation about race and racism and how it impacts climate change and the state of our reality today, and how it can inform the ways that we move forward. So Future Ancestor Services, I really highly recommend following us on Instagram and Twitter. I think those are the best ways to stay updated with us, to learn more about us. And again, you're going to see our hashtags, and our social tags later on in this presentation. Maintenant, je veux juste dire que je suis désolée que cette présentation est en anglais seulement. Alors, si vous voulez faire des questions en français, s'il vous plaît, faites-le. Je veux aussi saluer quelques mots de mon membre d'équipe, Chukwudi Enigmo. Il dit, en tant que francophone, de nombreux espaces environnementaux au Canada ne fonctionnent qu'en anglais et les connaissances produites restent uniquement en anglais. Je dois donc être pleinement présente, sachant que ma capacité de m'exprimer est limitée car je ne peux pas utiliser la langue de mon choix et que je dois parler en nom de 20-30% des Canadiennes et Canadiens qui ne sont pas bienvenus dans ces espaces en raison de leur langue. Alors, encore, si vous voulez faire des questions en français, s'il vous plaît, faites-le. J'espère que mon présentation va être encore bien pour toi et accessible pour toi. So understanding our intention. So we have we've in terms of what we're going to do today, and maybe I'll take a moment just to say, you may see me or hear me repeat words or get stuck. I'm recovering from a pretty severe brain injury that took place about a month ago. And I lost quite a bit of my speech for some time. My memory is really affected right now, so I have a really hard time with short-term memory. I actually took off work for all of this month except for this today. But you may find that I'm also moving. I've lost some of my feeling in the right side of my body, and so I lose feeling in my hands and my feet very quickly. So you may just see that I'm moving around. So I hope that's not distracting. But as kind of a check-in for me today, I just want to acknowledge that I'm going to do my best to be cohesive, to be clear, and to be articulate. But just know that it's very difficult for me to be on screen right now. I also have a chronic pain disability, and I'm in the middle of a pain flare right now. So you're going to hear me high energy, but again, my thinking maybe and my speech may be a bit discombobulated. So just bear with me as I'm managing those things kind of behind the screen. So in terms of our discussion today, we have a really big scope. First of all, I want to acknowledge, okay, we're seeking to inspire sustainable action that honors people, so humans, but that we're also going to acknowledge non-human kin in this conversation. So non-human kin can be the plants, the animals, living beings, spiritual beings, and earth, the land, the water, again, all living beings. We're going to talk a bit about why it's important to articulate this in a few slides. But really, we're looking at, okay, why do we need to talk about racial justice in our environmental work? Why do we need to do this? Why do we need to ask these questions when we're working in environmental work? And we're going to seek to provide you with some opportunities to explore some tools, some resources to explore a more profound and personalized understanding of how you can contribute to just and sustainable futures. That's a really big scope. That's really big, right? So we're going to narrow it down a little bit. I'm going to speak specifically to relationship to land. So we're going to address this, but we're going to follow one pathway with this. There's so many different ways that we could take this conversation. We're going to talk specifically to our relationship to land. Why we need to understand a history of colonialism and racism with regards to relationship to land, and how we can use our relationship to land to understand better how we can merge these efforts of environmental and racial justice. Now, before we dive in, I want to ask y'all, so you can answer this for yourself, but I really encourage you to contribute in the Slido. I'd really like to see this from y'all. So the question is, have you been able to access a provincial or national park since COVID-19 lockdowns began in March 2020? So have you gone to a national park or a provincial park or maybe even a municipal park that's been in the city, that's been just outside a city? Maybe you live close to a provincial park. Maybe you even live in a provincial park, depending on your status. So I'm going to ask y'all to go to Slido, and here, I'll do it with you. We'll go to slido.com. Okay, now let's enter a code. Let's enter the code. The code is 562437. I'll give you a second to look at that. 562437. Okay, I'm going to add that here. 562437. I'm going to click this arrow. Now we have the questionnaire, right? Have you been able to access a provincial or national park since COVID-19 lockdowns began in March 2020? I'm going to click yes many times because I go to one at least 2 times a week. So send. Awesome. We're seeing so many responses. This is awesome. I'm going to bring the slide back to here. 562437 is the code. And I'll give you about 1 more minute to do so. 562437. This is going to be important and interesting to talk about. And I kind of want you to start thinking about this. What is your relationship to land? Do you really value it, or is it a big part of your life? Is it not? If so, why not? We're going to be diving way more into this closer to the end. All right, awesome. We have so many respondents. We have close to 400. It looks like a lot of y'all are enjoying these parks quite a bit. Looks like some of y'all aren't really eager to get out, and that's okay too. And we see some of y'all want to get out but can't, and we're going to speak to that as well. So we'll come back to this poll in the second half of the presentation, but start thinking about this. How often do you get outside? And when I say get outside, I lived in Toronto for 7 years. It was very hard to actually feel like you're outside. I really struggled with this for quite a long time living out there. Because to me, outside means I don't want to see a concrete building anywhere close to me. I don't want to hear cars. And it was very hard to do that. It was very hard. And we're going to be speaking more to this. Again, we're going to come back to this as we go through today. Oops, sorry, not that. But I wanted to ask this question to introduce the pathway that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about relationship to land. We're going to talk about how a relationship to land and understanding only one kind of relationship to land has caused racist harm, has caused cultural genocide, and the creation of national and provincial parks. We're going to talk about this because right now, I think a lot of us are feeling the consequences of urban planning, our cities not prioritizing the protection of green spaces in the city, and then our provincial governments maybe not prioritizing the protection of our parks. Now, and many of us may be relying on these spaces, if we do have access to them, for mental health, for physical health. I sure am. Again, I'm out at a provincial or national park at least twice a week, at least at minimum. I'm heavily dependent on these parks. But it's important to understand the history of this. And again, I'm going to speak to relationship to land to explore why we need to talk about race as we do our environmental work. Because a lot of these parks were created with the intention of protecting wilderness, of protecting small plots of green spaces. But even with the best intended efforts, seeing only one relationship to land and working with only one relationship to land has caused a lot of harm. So we're going to go through, and first we're going to start with how racist beliefs have informed climate change and environmental protection. Again, we're going to talk about that in the scope of provincial and national parks. Then in the second part, we're going to seek to improve your capacity to understand your own relationship to land and to be critical of how your worldviews inform your approach to environmentalism. So we're going to really focus on the individual here. We do at Future Ancestors Services so much work with organizations in changing their policies, their statements, their capacity to do environmental work and to do systemic change, to change in a way that impacts a lot of people. Today, I'm going to be focusing more on the individual. I'm going to be focusing more on some practices, some reflection questions that you can engage with to shape the organizations around you, to shape the people around you. If you're an educator, to shape the minds that you have the privilege of shaping. And so I'm going to be speaking specifically to some practices that we can use to reflect and define our own relationship to land, with considerations and bringing in considerations of how race, colonialism could impact our own perception, our own approach to environmental work, and how that could maybe cause harm. And asking these questions is one of the first steps towards contributing to just and sustainable futures for diverse peoples, non-human kin, and Earth. And then finally, the last section is our resources for further learning. So we only have an hour together, but I really want you to leave with as much value as you can. And so in our last section, we're going to go through just some of the resources that I've shared with you in the slide deck. Again, make sure that you get the slide deck link right at the end. I'm also going to upload it to my Instagram stories after this keynote. Now, I just want to highlight that EECOM, this team has been amazing in setting up this conference. And I haven't really seen preparedness like this before, but they created an amazing activity sheet for y'all. So I just want to shout that out. And I just want to, let me get it open right here. So if you go to the keynotes page, you'll see here, student activity sheet. Awesome. So if you've already done it, great. If you haven't, you can still do the pre-keynote activity, and you can still do the Earth Day, like the keynote activity. But I just want to highlight this, that this is available to you. Again, you can click the link from your slide deck, or you can just go to Keynote or the EECOM Keynotes website and download the sheet. And you can follow along. You can type in, you can download it to your computer and type in your answers as you go along, as we go along, or you could do this afterwards. So I just really want to highlight that that's available to you. All right, so let's talk about objectivity, scientific objectivity, racial hierarchy, and Canadian parks. Again, really important to talk about, and understanding how racist beliefs have informed environmental protection work, right? So I'm going to open this space with Robin Wall-Kimmerer. For every section, we're going to speak to a quote from Braiding Sweetgrass. Braiding Sweetgrass, amazing book. I think if you're interested in, I'd say anything, this book is good for anyone to read. Robin Wall-Kimmerer is an Indigenous scientist, but again, her work is applicable to educators, to someone working in the arts, really to anyone. So we're going to use a couple quotes from her book today. The first is this: in the settler mind, land was property, real estate, capital, or natural resources. So in the mind of our government, the Canadian government, and to non-Indigenous peoples, land is property, real estate, capital, or natural resources. That's one relationship to land. But to our people, it was everything. Identity, the connection to our ancestors, the home of our non-human kinfolk, our pharmacy, our library, the source of all that sustained us. So Nancy opened our space with discussing a relationship to land that maybe some of you have never even heard of. But for many of us, for many people who have an Indigenous culture from anywhere in the world, often see land as an extension of self, land as an extension of culture, land as having her own inherent inalienable rights. the right to exist. This is a relationship to land. This is one worldview. Now, what has happened, especially in environmental work, is that one worldview has been positioned as the only valid, legitimate worldview. The only unbiased worldview. While all other worldviews, such as the second one that Robin described, are positioned as being too spiritual, as being biased, as being, oh, that's a nice to have, but we don't really need it. Where a non-Western worldview, where an indigenous worldview is deemed to be inferior. Now, we may not mean to do this, but the way that environmental work positions Western science and objectivity as the end all be all, the most superior way to talk about climate change and climate protection, is often done in a way that positions an indigenous worldview as being too spiritual, as being, yeah, we can have that, but we need the science to back it up. Because one worldview is being positioned as better than, as superior to the indigenous worldview. Now, where's the harm in doing this? And what does this have to do with parks? So let's take a look at that. So I'll read this slide first. The removal of the Kluane First Nations and the Champagne and Ashik First Nations, these are First Nations in what is currently Yukon. During the initial creation of the Kluane Game Sanctuary, now the Kluane National Park and Wildlife Reserve. And as another example, the later eviction of 25 First Nations and Métis Nations in the establishment of Jasper National Park, which is in what is currently Alberta, reflect not uncommon consequences of Western scientific objectivity in defining wilderness as terra nullius. So we're going to get into this word wilderness and terra nullius in a second. But this is important to talk about. Do y'all know the history of how our parks came to be? On who lived in these parks before our state government decided that they were going to be parks? It's very difficult to find the history of the peoples who lived there before in most national parks. There's a lot of plaques of pioneers and older white male explorers in these parks. It is very difficult to find plaques and to find easily accessible information of who lived in those parks before the Canadian government evicted these original caregivers from their lands. When Nancy said that so many people don't know who we are, they don't know that we exist, this has happened especially in our provincial, national, and even municipal parks. When last year, I guess it was 2019 now, I had the opportunity through a fellowship program to go and spend 2 weeks in Yukon and learn from Yukon Indigenous leaders, community members, and government workers. And I met Robin Bradash. And she had worked quite a bit with the Kluane First Nations, Champagne and Ashik First Nations in a lot of the healing work that needed to happen after the people's violent eviction of their traditional territories. So they worked a lot. Robin worked a lot with this community. And in a lot of her work, where she would have to travel and discuss some of the science, some of the planning and work that had to take place to mend relationships, to address the violence that had taken place in the removal of these First Nations from their traditional territory. In doing this work, she had this experience in Banff. I interviewed her for an article. If you're interested in reading the article and reading more about what I'm about to talk about, and specifically Kluane, Champagne, and Anishinaabeg, First Nations efforts to regain that relationship to land that was broken in their eviction. I wrote this article where I interviewed Robin. And this is one of the quotes that I got from this interview. We were talking about reintroducing First Nations people to the park, and it was so frustrating to me that the scientists were not able to recognize that people had been removed and that it had an impact, not only an impact on the land, but an impact on the people. There was such a lack of understanding about the true connection Indigenous people have with the land. So again, in the establishment of these provincial parks, again, the intention was to protect wilderness, to protect nature. And they were driven under these environmental protection efforts. Again, one relationship to land was being operated on. One relationship to land is being seen as property. Even if it's to say that this property is the property of the Crown, and we're going to make sure that no one else calls this their property. Natural resources are protected, but at times are taken, are extracted in these parks. One worldview was used to create these parks, and removing Indigenous peoples from these parks, because if people were in these parks or living in these parks, it wouldn't be considered wilderness. To remove them honored their relationship to land and understanding wilderness as being the whole total absence of people. But in doing so, caused so much violence. Indigenous cosmology, Indigenous worldviews, and I'm not speaking on all of them, but many of them, many of our cultures we have our own stories, we have our own teachings. But it's pretty consistent throughout these teachings, throughout these stories, of understanding humans as being a part of the ecosystem. We're part of it. So often in scientific thought, maybe you have some biology courses or science courses where you talk about ecosystems. One worldview sees humans as being separate from that ecosystem. So in a lot of your ecosystem diagrams, you may not see humans as at the top predator. You may see bears, wolves, predatory animals, but oftentimes humans are missing from those diagrams. Indigenous worldviews, again, with localized teachings and traditions and stories, often tell us and require us to think of humans as being within an ecosystem. Oftentimes we have unhealthy, unbalanced relationships with the rest of our ecosystems. But for millennia, Indigenous peoples on this land who understood themselves as being part of the ecosystem had a balanced and respectful relationship with the other members of that ecosystem. But the ways that parks were created was operated with the understanding that there's all these ecosystems, and in order for these ecosystems to be operating in the wilderness, we have to completely remove all humans from that. Now, this separation of land, because our worldviews see land as an extension of self, as an extension of culture. The removal from land is a very violent act. It is removing us from our stories, from our education, from our schools, from our spirituality, from our language, from our ancestors and spiritual sites, sacred sites. This trauma, when inflicted, is felt throughout generations. Felt throughout generations. And it is not only the people that feel the consequences of being dispossessed from our land, from having our relationship to land severed in such a violent way. In the Kluane Game Sanctuary, scientists found that after removing indigenous peoples from these parks, who have again existed cohesively in a balanced relationship with their ecosystem, disrupted the ecosystem. And what they saw was a very quick spike in the wolf population. That is a top predator. Uncontrolled wolf population led to a kind of trickle-down effect where the entire ecosystem became out of balance because indigenous peoples had a balanced relationship with these wolves. And I'm not here to speak on behalf of Kluane First Nations. I'm not here to speak on behalf of these peoples. But from the teachings I've received from these lands and from the people who have shared their stories and expected us to carry these stories on, they have made it very clear how a balanced relationship, specifically with the wolf population, maintained a balance within the ecosystem. And removing these people from the land, not in this environmental protection work, not only led to this form of cultural genocide, it also caused more harm to the ecosystem than good. And what we saw here, and what was being acted on, is again this idea of terra nullius, nobody's land. And again, associating wilderness with this idea that it has to be separate from indigenous peoples. It's often positioned as objective too. When we talk about wilderness, when wilderness is defined in science, it's often described as the absence of people. And this is a way of thinking that justified this way of thinking, this worldview, this relationship to land, is one way that justified the removal of indigenous peoples from these lands, but also justified that our cultures, our relationships to land are inferior to the way that government and settlers understand a relationship to land. Terra nullius, nobody's land. It is in fact somebody's land, provincial and national parks, government's land. But it's used as a way to position this worldview, this relationship to land, as being better than anyone else's. Why? Why are they so focused on, why are they so threatened by another relationship to land? Why is our government, Why are people who have removed Indigenous peoples from their land so threatened by Indigenous peoples being on their land and honoring our relationship to land? Bringing sweetgrass. Whether it was their homeland or the new land forced upon them, land held in common gave people strength. It gave them something to fight for. And so, in the eyes of the federal government, that belief was a threat. Holding land in common, having balanced relationship with land, honoring land as having its own inherent, inalienable rights, just like we have human rights, corporations have their rights. Thinking of land and environment as having its own rights is a threat. Is a threat to taking natural resources, is a threat to owning property and defiling it as you choose, and polluting as you choose. It affects the way we can gain profit from the way we use the land. This is a threat. People holding land and relating to land in a way that honors its rights, in a way that we see it as an extension of self, is a threat. And so this violent removal of Indigenous peoples from these parks, this racist belief that our relationships to land are not as good, are inferior to colonial Canadian relationships to land, and using all these other reasons to justify why Indigenous peoples are less than, causes a lot of harm. And a big reason why that harm is caused is because our way of being is a threat. Is a threat to capitalism, colonialism, is a threat to power in the way that we understand it today. Now, we just talked about two relationships to land. And we talked about how one relationship to land, that of the government and of settler worldviews, non-Indigenous worldviews, see a relationship to land. We saw how failing to have a discussion of acknowledging that and acknowledging maybe some racist intentions for that relationship to land, some profit intentions with that relationship to land, historical reasons for that relationship to land, without acknowledging that, Indigenous relationships to land were deemed inferior, were neglected, were actively erased, and because of that, we see cultural genocide and disruptions to ecosystems that have existed for millennia in balance. And even if we're calling this environmental protection work in the interest of preserving nature, despite the intention, the impact was still harmful. In environmental work, this often happens where we lead with our relationship to land with the best of intentions, while failing to see that other people's relationship to land are valid and actually bring a lot of knowledge and opportunities to lead into just and sustainable futures. But failing to recognize that by pushing that aside and deeming ours as being the only way to go forward, harms not only our supposed interest in protecting an environment, but also harms complete cultures and groups of people, which is not just and is not sustainable. But what about your own relationship to land and how it affects the way you come to environmental work? How does your relationship to land help you get through the collective trauma that many of us are experiencing right now? It's been a hard week in the news. Many of us have had family members affected by COVID. The state of work environments and conditions that teachers are managing right now is unjust. It's difficult. I come from 6 generations of teachers, and I really feel for educators right now. And as we are committed to doing environmental work, we also have to acknowledge that we are going through a lot as well. How can we bring a relationship to land that offers healing and moves towards just and sustainable futures? How can we do that? How can we bring in considerations of race and racism, of our history, to make sure that we're moving forward in just and sustainable ways? Our last excerpt from Braiding Sweetgrass. The land knows you even when you are lost. As the land becomes impoverished, so too does the scope of our vision. The land knows you even when you are lost. It is so important that as we do environmental work, as we navigate such difficult times, that we honor our relationship to land, that we are conscious of it and how it impacts the way we do our environmental work. We have to acknowledge that this idea of just going outside, for many of us, our relationship to land requires us to physically access land. Let's go back to the poll. About half of y'all, over half of us, have gone out and been able to access parks many times, or at least a few times. About 20% of you wanted to but couldn't. I know living in Toronto, I wanted to all the time, but really could not access nature in the way that I needed to. Before diving into this, I just want to acknowledge that there are systemic barriers that actively work against us accessing nature. For example, spatial polarization and segregation. There's a link here if you want to see the cited kind of document for this, but I'm going to just mention it really quickly. For example, most Canadian cities have disproportionate give disproportionate access to public transit for communities that are predominantly Black, Indigenous, and racialized. So if you live in a neighborhood that is non-white, essentially, predominantly non-white, statistically speaking, you're going to have a more difficult time accessing public transit that can bring you to many of these parks. Again, research is there if you want to know more about it. Sometimes we may not feel safe in nature. We saw in the news earlier last year how a Black man, Christian Cooper, who was bird watching, was racially profiled and attacked by Amy Cooper, who is Canadian, in New York City. He was accessing nature. He was enjoying nature. And in that time, he was positioned in a very safe and unsafe and violent situation. This is not uncommon. And this can cause a very significant barrier to us feeling safe, to physically honor our relationship to land and be in nature. It can look like not having representation in outdoor education, in not seeing our cultures, in not seeing our faces represented in those leading environmental education. Even buying outdoor gear and not feeling like you belong there, and not feeling like you're represented there, and not finding clothes that fit you. These can all create barriers to you feeling like you're comfortable or safe to go in nature and honor your relationship to land. This is important to acknowledge. But as I continue and as I continue discussing our relationship to land, it's important to understand these barriers. Are there barriers that I'm experiencing? What is stopping me from going out to nature? And so I'm going to provide you a document that will really help you explore this relationship to land in a bit of a deeper way, in recognizing that we're coming up at about 10 minutes out, and I want to give some time for some Q&A. But if we look at why we're even having this discussion, relationship to land, I think it's really important to have this discussion now. Again, it can help us manage and get through our trauma, understand our trauma. And it can also help us ensure and explore how our worldview, what our worldview is, what our identity is because of these worldviews, what are our values, to understand how this impacts the way we understand environmentalism. And the better we understand ourselves in doing this work, the better we're able to identify, oh, they have a different understanding of relationship to land than I do. I want to understand more about that to see how we can bring the best of both of these relationships to lead to, again, these more just and sustainable futures. Now, I've created this reflection question document. So y'all have access to this in your slides. And these questions and these practices are coming from 3 Instagram posts from Future Ancestor Services. Now, you can access them for way more information. We've discussed wilderness as terra nullius, as cultural genocide. We have a whole post about that with more information, more resources to understand it better if I've gone over it too fast. We've created a post about honoring our relationship to land in an urban environment. So exactly what I'm speaking to now. Here are some ways that you can honor your relationship if you don't have access to nature in the way that many of us may have. Where you have barriers to accessing nature, here are other ways that you can still honor your relationship to land. And then finally, our environmentalism and really thinking about how are we decentering humans from this universe. Oftentimes it's humans and then the ecosystems around us instead of humans within the ecosystem. And so this post really goes through this idea of Earth having its own rights to exist. And how does our environmentalism create space for other worldviews of relationships to land? So this document has a bunch of cool questions that you can go through as an individual or with your organization, with your club, with a team. Some questions. What is your relationship to land? So what does a lack of access to nature, how does a lack of access to nature impact my mental and physical health? How have my experiences in nature or lack thereof influenced my identity and values? How does my home environment reflect my relationship to land? So how does the pictures I put up, the things that I have in my house, reflect how I feel about my relationship to land, my relationship to nature? What gifts do I receive when I access nature? So when I am in nature, what do I get from that? The fresh air, this feeling of being away from it all, a feeling of being grounded, Maybe your gym. I go out on runs on trails all the time. And so what do you get from that? And then how does my relationship to land inform my environmentalism? So what am I doing in my life to honor and protect Earth? How is my environmentalism acknowledging that our efforts are also in the interest of Earth's nature's right to persist and maintain its vital cycles? Not just the way that environment serves humans and what we can take from it. How does your environmentalism position humans as a part of an ecosystem and not separate from? How does your environmentalism create space for Indigenous leadership? How are they empowered to enact localized teachings of sustainable practices that honor human relationship to Earth and nature? And then finally in this document, you have some practices, and I encourage you to build this list. Some practices that you can do to honor your relationship to land without physically being in nature. Our relationship to land is not just what we do, what we get from being in nature. It's also what we think of it, how we express this relationship. So doing this through art, or taking your shoes off in your backyard and just sitting and letting your feet touch the earth. Planning dream trips. I did this all the time in Toronto, where I just plan these cool trips. I haven't gone on any of them yet, but it really helped me think about what is important to me about land. When I travel, who do I want to learn from? What do I want to do? That can be relaxing, exciting, and inspirational. And then explore books about outdoor survival skills and nature. Understand what your worldview is. Understand what your relationship to land is and how it impacts how you understand environmental work. Start with you, because then you're in better position to identify they're talking about their relationship to land there, or they're talking about a worldview that's different from mine. Let me explore that a bit more. Let me understand that a bit more. Wow, that's really cool how they understand that way of relating to land. Let me reflect on how that affects my relationship to land. What can I learn from that and how I relate to land? And the questions that were included in that document are going to help us start identifying the ways by which we could be causing harm. It helps us have conversations moving forward about this idea of worldviews being different, but not one being always better than the other. Now, just a quick note. I know I've covered a ton of stuff. You have these further learning resources. They're all links, and they all just dive deeper into everything that I talked about. There's videos, there's books, there's articles, there's units, there's so much information about ancestral accountability, about these hierarchies, and then about your relationship to land, that being the handout that I just showed you. Now I know we're running tight on time. So at this time, I maybe will be able to address one question. I know, Lindsay, you're going to bring the questions out. So maybe could we just address the top question for now? And I can do my best to respond to the other questions via Instagram.
Absolutely. That's a great plan. And actually, my first question for you is if you wouldn't mind shutting down the Slido Q&A. Some of our participants, unfortunately, have used it as a space to put in some really inappropriate things. So if you could just shut down the Slido poll, that would be great. And then one question that came in a while ago, actually, as you were speaking, was about, it came in from Andrea Tremblay, and she was wondering, from your perspective, how can non-Indigenous people and white settler descendants learn to adopt or act in an Indigenous worldview while showing appreciation and not appropriation? So what are some first steps that we as non-Indigenous folks can think about as we're heading down that road?
Yeah, so when I was in high school, I did a lot of traveling, I did a lot of work in cultures that weren't my own. In my first years of university, I lived in Turkey. I lived abroad, again, in cultures that weren't my own. And I had this sense of loss and feeling like I'm not a full person. I don't know who I am. I see all these people so sure of their cultures and who they are. And in doing that work, I didn't feel that I had that for myself. And because of that, I was more likely to adopt these little fragments from everyone else's culture and still not feel whole, and did some inappropriate things. So my first and most important advice for that is to really, and I opened with this, understanding your ancestry. Now, not all of us have direct access to a genealogy tree, but we do have some ideas. Most of us have some ideas of who we are generally. Like, I know I'm Jamaican, but I can't trace my lineage past my grandma. But I still was able, and I still pursued that research to understand who are those people, what led to the situation where I don't know who they are. And from there, understanding a bit more, I'm not going to adopt all these Jamaican cultural pieces because that's not me, that's not how I was brought up. But I'm at least aware of that and able to acknowledge that. And there's some teachings that I've allowed to shape the way that I think. So I really encourage you to start thinking of where your culture comes from and how your culture, how your ancestors related to land, and what that means to you now. And starting there, I always hear white people say, oh, I don't really have a culture. Like, my mom was Scottish, my dad was British, but we don't really know much past that. But there are very lively traditions of and relationships with land from those ancestors. There are opportunities to understand that better. And I really encourage you to start with yourself, to start with what you know first, deepen that understanding, and then to benefit from the gifts of these other cultures and these other cultural teachings. If you do benefit from them, to always acknowledge where that comes from, to always acknowledge the elders, the nations that you receive those teachings from, and to say, I'm not speaking on behalf of them. This is what has been gifted to me. I've been told that I'm allowed to share this. And this is how it's changed the way that I see. So those are a couple of
That's great. That's great advice. Thank you very much.